So there are two purposes, really, for today and for the call today. We're marking 75 years of the Canadian Council of Churches. We were founded in 1944. And as one way to mark this event, we wanted to organize this cross-Canada conversation on the theme of what is the place of Christianity in Canada today. Thank you so much for taking time to register and to participate with us. That's really the main purpose, is to have that both mark the 75th anniversary and have this conversation across the country. And so I'm ready to move to the next screen, Stephen, if you want to take us there. You can advance the next PowerPoint. So I'm hoping that you all can see all right the PowerPoint slides as they roll through. And sometimes there will be a slide with a picture or text, and sometimes you'll see the presenters. But I'm hoping this program came into your email inbox. It should have been attached to the confirmation email you received. And it just lists the kind of the timing and the topics step by step of how the day will unfold. So we're here just doing the welcomes, and we'll take a moment to center ourselves with a reading and a prayer and a song. And then we'll invite Stephen to say a few words as president of the Canadian Council of Churches. And we're fortunate to have the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches recorded a brief message for us too. And then we'll roll into the presenters. We have 5 of them on the line. And we're hoping that this is not only a passive listening experience, but that at a few different times along the way, we'll check in with you about, with some questions, and take a moment for dialogue between us in the chat box and in places where there's a local group with one another. Okay, so if you're having trouble finding that program but would like to have it, I suggest maybe you just drop your email address in the chat box, and I believe Nicole, the communications coordinator, could send it right your way so it comes in. All right, Stephen, on to the next one. This is another resource page that you might want to consider visiting during the call if you're wanting to click around and make a few more links. This is the page that you come to if you click on the opening page, the landing page, and there's information there about the presenters. There's some highlights from the September 26th Ecumenical Worship Gathering, the public worship service that we organized here in Toronto last month, a month ago. Some nice pictures there, as well as if you click on the news item that comes up at the top of the page, and the news item about the September 26th service, you'll find, for example, the really wonderful address by moderator Amanda Curry on growing up together. It's another nice resource that's been gifted to us, part of this process. So I wanted to point out that webpage. One more then, Stephen, please click on through. So take a moment to take a deep breath, and let me invite you to join in silently or with others who are there in this brief act of adoration and prayer. This is really adapted from the first public worship service that was held in Toronto in 1944, and the text comes from there with a few adaptations. So let me lead you with just an alternating English and French reading and response of this act of adoration. God is spirit, and they who worship God must worship in spirit and in truth. Glory be to God on high. Dieu est puissance. Ceux qui espèrent dans le Seigneur renouvellent leur force. Gloire à Dieu à plus haut des cieux. God is light, and in God is no darkness at all. Glory be to God on high. Dieu est juste et son nom est saint. Gloire à Dieu au plus haut des cieux. And in that first worship service starting the council some 75 years ago, there were two texts that were part of that service, and this is one of them. And let me lead this to a brief reading, a reminder of this text from Ephesians 4, verses 1 to 7, and then a second part of Ephesians that comes next. This is the Apostle Paul. I, therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. But each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Puis le verset 13 au 16. Jusqu'à ce que nous parvenions tous ensemble à l'unité dans la foi et dans la connaissance du Fils de Dieu, à l'état des adultes, à la taille du Christ dans sa plénitude. Ainsi, nous ne serons plus les enfants, bariotés, menés à la dérive à tout vent de doctrine, joués par les hommes et leur astuce à fourvoyer dans l'erreur. Mais, confessant la vérité dans l'amour, nous grandirons à tous égards vers celui qui est la tête, Christ. Et c'est de lui que le corps tout entier, coordonné et bien uni grâce à toutes les articulations qui le desserrent, selon une activité répartie à la mesure de chacune, réalise sa propre croissance pour se construire lui-même dans l'amour. And for this one, this is just a short song, and you may want to just hum along, or let me lead you in just a singing of Laudate omnes gentes. Laudate omnes gentes, laudate Dominum, 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 laudate omnes gentes, laudate Dominum. Stephen, could you say a word about the theme and the topic today and the event?
I'd be happy to. Can I just make sure that I'm able to be seen and heard? Stephen?
It's loud and clear. Go ahead, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to add my welcome to that of Peter's. I'd like to say and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples on what's called Amherst Island near Kingston, which was originally known to the Iroquois nation as Kaonesco. And it strikes me that we could have many, many acknowledgements of traditional territories from coast to coast to coast today. And that's part of the excitement that I'm feeling now as we enter into these conversations. And I pray that as we meet, this is also part of seeking to live out the calls to action in our relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. So as Peter said, there's a couple of reasons why we wanted to have an event such as this. It's part of our 75th anniversary. It represents a desire to connect across the country and not just in the Toronto zone, which we're sometimes accused of being too close to talk about the place of Christianity today. And we hope that it will also help the decision-making process of the Canadian Council of Churches as we prepare for planning for the future, for the coming years. We've done a number of events that look toward, that sort of speak to these questions that we're going to be speaking to today, and there'll be more to come. I'll say a bit about that in a moment. I expect I'm not the only one who listened to Kanye West's new album, Jesus is King, this morning. If you manage to get through to track 8, Hands On, there's a kind of maybe an indicting or compelling line. He says, what have you been hearing from the Christians? What have you been hearing from the Christians? And I think this is what we're going to do today. You know, it's a question we need to ask ourselves. What are we hearing from Christians in the public sphere today? But we are very fortunate today to have a number of excellent presenters who come from significant areas that are relevant to the conversation of Christianity in Canada today. Now, I should say the areas we're focusing on are by no means exhaustive or complete. And we're not expecting our speakers to speak even specifically on the areas that we're focusing on. We could not expect Bishop Simard, for example, to represent the entire Francophone reality of Christianity in Canada, nor could we ask Mary Fontaine to speak to the entire Indigenous experience in Canada. These are Christian leaders in their area who will address the topic of Christianity in Canada today in the way they deem appropriate. And we thank them for this and look forward to their insights very much. In addition to this simply being, I think, a very interesting afternoon, and depending on where you are, morning, reflecting on the place of Christianity in Canada today, this is one of 4 events aimed at helping the CCC focus its direction for the next triennium. It began with the executive of the Canadian Council having a couple of days of retreat together, thinking of this. There was a 75th anniversary worship service at York Minster Park Baptist Church, where the Canadian Council was born 75 years ago. That was in September. And the service was prefaced with a gathering of leaders from the Canadian Council of Churches over the years, general secretaries, past presidents, past vice presidents, chairs, and members of various commissions. That was a very rich conversation, which considered these questions too. We have today's event, and then the governing board in November will carry on the conversation. Peter suggested to me that I just maybe give a few thoughts about how I see this in my own church, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, where I've served for some 20 years in denominational leadership. And I guess first I'd say those 20 years have been marked by the legacy of residential schools. We're still learning, we're still working on a new path for our journey in light of that terrible legacy. 20 years have also been a period in our denomination, and I think many, of continued decline in the church, at least by the number of worshipers. While this started in the late 60s, I think our church at least, we're finally realizing that it's happening and trying to address it. Where we once had a much more significant presence in Francophone Canada, I am sad to say, I think we have 1, perhaps 2 among our 900 worshiping communities that is French speaking or worshiping. And so that aspect is very important. Our church also, and the CCC, the Canadian Council of Churches, have been enjoying new connections with new Canadians. Some of our most vibrant churches are filled with new Canadians. and some of the new denominations with the Canadian Council of Churches also represent this. So all of this is to say that for me and for our church, and I hope I speak for you also, this is a very relevant conversation that we're having. Your feedback is welcomed at points in the program. There's the chat that's been mentioned already, and we'll be very grateful to receive any participant insights by email or phone after today's event as well. And so I say thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the afternoon, and I think I have a few moments to speak at the end.
That's great, Stephen. Excellent. So that's a fantastic way to sort of set the stage. And let me just invite Stephen to click through to a short video clip from the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches that he recorded earlier this year to mark the 75th anniversary of the Canadian Council of Churches.
Dear sisters and brothers in Christ, on behalf of the World Council of Churches, I send the congratulations and greetings to all of you as you celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Canadian Council of Churches. You are a pioneer. You are older than the World Council of Churches, and you're also a pioneer in working for unity, for justice, for peace and reconciliation in your country and far beyond. We see in the churches in Canada a very strong ecumenical commitment, and we feel it every day as a strong support to what we do also as a World Council of Churches. This was very clear and visible when you hosted the assembly in 1983 in Vancouver. You brought then also new dimensions and new agendas for the World Council of Churches. One of them was the very important contribution from the First Nations, and therefore also to our program for indigenous peoples. But you also have raised issues of truth and reconciliation in your country and with relevance for the world and the many other parts of the world where such processes and such commissions are urgently needed. We have now started preparing the 11th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. It will be held in Germany, in Karlsruhe, in 2021, with the theme, Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. It's quite clear to me that your experiences and your contributions will be very significant in preparing this Assembly and in the Assembly itself. To work for reconciliation and unity requires a sense of truth and justice to be fulfilled, but also to understand how to work as Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ today, showing the love of Christ and how the love of Christ moves us and moves the world into new realities that only God can create. But where we are asked to participate and to work together as you do as churches in Canada. May God bless you, and may God bless your journey also in the years ahead.
Great, thank you, Stephen, for monitoring that again and showing that. So just a comment on that, it's great to have several different world Christian communions that we connect with, the World Evangelical Alliance, the World Council of Churches, the Vatican, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and those global ecumenical relations are very important for the life of the Council. And while the World Council of Churches and the Canadian Council of Churches are not the same, and we're not part of the same organization even, we are all part of one ecumenical movement. And so it's great to be in this journey together. Okay, so those are, let's say, some introductory pieces about the event and the time, the topic. And I would just like to, in the program, we're at the section that says, who are we in this conversation? And let me just say that this is a time to switch the action. And this is the first of maybe 2 or 3 more times when I'll invite you to just put into the chat box, who are you and what brings you to the conversation today? If you're monitoring on your own laptop, just a short sentence or a phrase would be great. If you're meeting in Saskatoon or in Ottawa or some other location and you're with a few others, we'll take just 2 minutes of quiet and turn to one another to say, actually, what brought you here? What are you hoping to hear today during the conversation? What are you listening for? And maybe someone there who's connected to the keyboard can put in just a couple of those responses in the chat box too. So I'm going to go quiet now for 2 minutes until 1:35 on my screen, when we'll move to listening to the participants. So please bring that group chat box to life. Super, so great to see all these folks, all of you clicking in. And again, let me encourage you to use that box and note some comments or questions as they show up in your conversation or in your own mind as you're watching and following. Okay, so shifting now to the part of our program where we're listening to some other folks who have done some reflection and preparation. They've been asked to share their perspectives from where they are. That's Pastor JoAnne Lamb and Bishop Noël Simard and Dr. Marie Wilson. Some of their details are on the screen in front of you, and their bios were, of course, also on the poster sheet that was circulated, and they're also on that website page that I pointed to you to earlier, if you'd like to know more about who they are and where they come from. But we'll start with Pastor JoAnne Lamb, and then it's Bishop Noël Simard. And just a reminder, Bishop Noël Simard has been asked to speak in French, even though he's perfectly bilingual. He's a wonderful man to work with. I've learned so much from him. We have asked that he speak in French, so be ready with your closed captioning or the interpretation if you're English speaking and would like to follow along in that way. And then Dr. Marie Wilson, I want to mention that we've also asked her to speak from a slightly different perspective. If Pastor JoAnne and Bishop Noël and Pastor Ken and Pastor Mary are speaking from a churchy context and maybe from their mission and ministry context, we've really asked Dr. Marie Wilson to reflect from her personal experience, but also in the wake of what Stephen mentioned has been such a formative thing in the life of churches in Canada recently, in the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools. So she's bringing a slightly different perspective. We'll hear from these three, and then we'll have a pause again, a participant moment connection piece. And then we'll hear from Pastor Ken and Pastor Mary. And then there'll be some conversation among them, and then a bit more cross-Canada conversation. So, Stephen, if you could bring up Pastor JoAnne, that would be great. And I wonder, I've noticed that when I speak and when Stephen Kendall was speaking, we're in small screens alongside many other little boxes. I wonder if you can enlarge her picture so that she fills the whole screen when she speaks. And the same for Bishop Noël along the way. Bingo. Nice, thank you. Over to you, JoAnne.
So just want to check, make sure, checking,
It all sounds good. Thank you,
Good,
JoAnne.
awesome. So first, thank you for this opportunity. And of course, I have to say, hi, Mom, hi, Dad. I think the question that was posed to us in terms of what is the place of Christianity in Canada today is a similar question that I often ask myself throughout the previous 42 years of what is my place in the world? Why am I necessary as a Christian, as a person? And so it made me think back to when I was at the ripe age of 10 and a half. Of course, I knew everything about the world. I moved with my parents from Hong Kong to Saskatchewan. If you want to know the place, it's Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. And so you can imagine I probably stood out in most places. And so my motivation and purpose of being at that point was to blend in. So I spoke without an accent as much as possible, and I dressed like everybody else because I really didn't want to stick out. It wasn't until I was about 20 something that I realized that perhaps God put me in this context to stick out. That was maybe my purpose in life, to bring a different perspective in all of the situations and experiences, to propose an alternative of looking at that situation and add a diversity to how we see the world, and that there is beauty beyond what is the status quo. So back to our question of the place of Christianity, I think that is perhaps our task, to stick out where there is the status quo, where there is an establishment of that's how we do things. So without really delving into the Christianity in terms of what do you see, who is Jesus and all of that, if we just were to say Jesus was a guy, first century Palestinian Jew who just found a few people that believed in what he was saying, this alternative way of being, this social change where the orphans and the widows weren't ignored, where the poor were uplifted into the conversation, where the people that weren't seen were brought into light. So until those things are all gone and out of our own context, where there is no longer injustice in our world, then probably there is still a very vibrant and needed place for Christianity. Not only in Canada, but that is specifically to our context too. And so what exactly is the question asking for? Perhaps is how we are making ourselves relevant. And so if you visit the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada website, you'll see in our logo on the very bottom as a reminder to ourselves and also to others that we are called to be in mission for others. Historically, we've been in mission for ourselves, And that would probably be the reason why I'm a Christian at this point, and I'm grateful for that. But I think we've learned now that we need to be a mission for others, for a world that is in need of clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, imprisoned and the lonely needs accompaniment, where we need to go into the dark and deep and lonely places and sit and be with people. Where when we're talking about in our Canadian context, where access to support because they're living with mental illness, or how even we as a church model how we speak about mental illness is something that is going to change that status quo. That perhaps we need to speak about how do we be with people as they are facing end of life. That not only is a human right, but that the intrinsic part of a human being dignified in the birth through the span of life to the death is something that we know how to speak to and how we can bring a different perspective. And so as being hands and feet of Christ, a manifestation of Christ in the world, God's mission in the world, we are relevant because we do what we speak. And so I think in the question of what is the place of Christianity, especially in the work that we've been doing in the Commission on Faith and Witness, I think it is to show and model that we are willing to go to a place where we really might not know or understand. As a whole bunch of theologians around a table, we've picked a topic about theology of person and mental illness. Most of us went around and thought we need to talk about it, but we don't have the expertise. That is where we need to show that we wrestle with the topics and issues that are relevant to the world, and what is the grace of God speaking to the trouble of the world. And so in that light, as liberated by God's grace, as all seen as a creation of God and people of God, may we continue to live out, not only in prayer and worship, but to advocate and to act and infiltrate all corners of the world in society, because we'll continue to live out our mission to be a mirror of God's presence in the world. Thank you.
Bishop Simard, over to you. Stephen, could you switch the screens? Okay. There we are. Yeah, lovely. Yes. C'est à vous.
Could I make a suggestion? I know that the closed captioners need to switch their audio feed, and other people might be interested to listen to the English translation as well. So before Bishop Simard speaks in English, speaks in French, I'm going to put the telephone numbers for the closed captioning into the chat. And if anybody wants to listen to the English translation, they can dial into the phone there. And I'm just kind of filling some space so that the French closed captioner can switch from listening to the translator to switch to listening to the Zoom meeting. I needed to give her a little bit of time to make that transition. So Bishop Simard, I apologize for interrupting, and thank you for your patience, and please go ahead.
Bonjour, et de ma part aussi, un grand merci au Conseil canadien des Églises de m'avoir invité pour prendre la parole. Mais je veux d'abord féliciter le Conseil canadien des Églises pour ce 75e anniversaire et pour le travail vraiment exceptionnel fait pendant ces 75 ans pour l'unité chrétienne. Bravo, et puisse le Seigneur continuer d'accompagner les membres, la vie et le travail du Conseil canadien des Églises. Quelle est la place du christianisme au Canada aujourd'hui? Eh bien, je vais en parler surtout avec la vision du Québec, bien sûr du Canada français, mais particulièrement du Québec. Et je dois dire que le Canada français, et tout particulièrement le Québec, a connu une évolution incroyable au niveau religieux depuis 50 ans, et qui s'est caractérisé par un pluralisme qui s'est manifesté par une plus grande diversité d'opinions et d'idées, une diversité des comportements qui reposent sur des systèmes de conviction différents, et une diversité de religions. Autrefois, au Canada, on était comme un bloc, au Canada français, on était comme un bloc monolithique, surtout catholique. Eh bien, je dois dire que, et encore à peine 20 ans, on pouvait compter sur un fonds culturel chrétien, catholique, pour l'annonce de l'Évangile. Mais ce n'est plus le cas. Comme on peut le lire dans un document produit par la Conférence des évêques catholiques canadiens, aujourd'hui, malheureusement, on assiste au drame de la fragmentation qui ne permet plus d'avoir une référence unifiante. En outre, se produit souvent le phénomène de personnes qui désirent appartenir à l'Église, mais qui sont profondément influencées par une vision de la vie en opposition avec la foi. Fin de la citation. Eh bien, le pluralisme que nous connaissons actuellement au Québec et au Canada français, et je pense que ça s'applique aussi au Canada, peut s'expliquer par différents mouvements. Au Québec, par exemple, mouvement de déconfessionnalisation des institutions, des associations comme les écoles et les hôpitaux, qui autrefois étaient catholiques, courant de sécularisation qui conduit à une culture et un mode de vie dans lequel on n'a plus de référence aux religieux et aux sacrés. Puis le développement aussi fulgurant des technologies numériques qui a engendré des réseaux d'échange sans précédent où circulent toutes les idées et idéologies, tous les courants d'opinion et de conviction, toutes les philosophies et spiritualités. Alors, je pense qu'on peut parler aujourd'hui du développement incroyable de l'Internet et des réseaux sociaux où on circule beaucoup d'idées et d'idéologies. Mais c'est sûr que ces réseaux sociaux apportent une proximité, mais c'est une proximité virtuelle qui risque parfois d'enfermer les gens dans une bulle numérique illusoire et factice, loin du réel. Il faut aussi noter dans l'univers canadien francophone une sorte de militantisme anti-religieux qui s'oppose fortement à la religion et à sa présence sur la place publique. On veut vraiment que la religion reste au niveau privé. Et bien sûr que les scandales d'abus sexuels ont vraiment terni l'image de l'Église. Et avec raison, parce que ce sont des crimes répugnants. Mais je pense qu'il faut dépasser, et bien sûr qu'il y a un temps de guérison. Puis il faut retrouver au plan de l'Église une crédibilité. Enfin, le catholicisme au Canada français n'a plus ce caractère de bloc monolithique comme autrefois. Tout en se disant encore catholique, bon nombre de Québécois, par exemple, ont des vues ou des convictions très différentes sur des sujets fondamentaux comme la famille, le mariage, la sexualité, les ministères de l'Église. Et je pourrais citer, par exemple, comment le débat sur l'euthanasie exprime des idées très différentes au niveau des Québécois qui s'affichent encore catholiques. Alors, on est peut-être passé d'un monde chrétien qui était comme un centre à une périphérie. Et ça, c'est difficile à accepter, mais je pense que c'est l'image de la place du christianisme dans le Canada aujourd'hui. Alors, que doit-on faire pour faire en sorte que le christianisme ait sa place dans le Canada aujourd'hui? Eh bien, moi, je pense qu'il faut d'abord et avant tout vivre et agir comme le levain dans la pâte, avoir une forme plus discrète de présence et de témoignage. Deuxièmement, je pense qu'il faut être capable, encore là, de prendre la parole pour exprimer justement notre identité, notre foi et aussi revendiquer cette capacité de prendre la parole au plan public. Et là, c'est toute la question de la liberté religieuse, liberté de conscience, qui actuellement est menacée. Et deuxième ou plus troisième aspect, c'est l'engagement social. Je crois que notre place comme chrétiens-chrétiennes au Canada aujourd'hui va être reconnue en autant que nous pratiquions ce que nous disons, en autant que nous mettons en pratique et en acte concret notre foi et cette joie de l'Évangile. On ne peut plus uniquement parler et ne rien faire. Il faut vraiment agir et en des actes qui rejoignent les gens là où ils sont et surtout les démunis et les laisser pour compte de notre société. Oui, il faut aussi retrouver notre place dans l'espace public, car la foi chrétienne a commencé par une présentation de Jésus-Christ, par l'annonce de l'Évangile sur la place publique. Alors, on ne peut pas uniquement reléguer la foi chrétienne à la chambre à coucher ou à la vie dans la maison personnelle. Il faut être capable de manifester notre foi, bien sûr, dans le respect et l'acceptation de la divergence d'idées et d'opinions. Enfin, je pense qu'il faut revenir aux sources. Et les sources, c'est Jésus-Christ. Jésus-Christ qui nous invite à faire un choix décisif à sa suite. Le pape François nous parle d'une église synodale, c'est-à-dire d'une église qui marche ensemble. Et ça, je pense qu'on ne peut plus rester séparés les uns des autres. Il faut travailler ensemble, il faut marcher ensemble, et vivre notre foi à la suite du Christ ensemble. Et en terminant, je pense qu'on ne peut que prendre le virage missionnaire. Avoir une conversion missionnaire, ça veut dire être une église en sortie, une église qui va vers les périphéries. Je pense que tout à l'heure, Marie-Anne en a parlé, une église qui va rejoindre les gens qui vivent à la périphérie de notre cœur et de notre société. D'où la nécessité de faire route avec ces gens qui souvent sont laissés pour compte, oubliés, pour qu'ils puissent revenir, non pas à nous comme Église, mais au Christ d'abord, qui est le véritable cœur, le centre et le moteur de notre foi. Et en terminant, moi je pense que malgré les difficultés, il faut être des chrétiens et chrétiennes pleins d'espérance et de joie. Et je me fais le porte-parole du pape François qui dit comment il faut affirmer, annoncer et vivre la joie de l'Évangile et la joie de l'amour. Et je l'ai vu vendredi dernier en visitant lors de la nuit des sans-abri 3 villes de mon diocèse où il y avait des activités pour les sans-abri et comment cela, et c'est de l'Évangile en acte. Et c'est comme ça que je crois qu'on va retrouver notre place en, non pas uniquement annonçant Jésus-Christ, mais en l'apportant dans des actes et dans un mode de vie qui est vraiment évangélique. Merci beaucoup.
Wow, Monsieur Simard, merci beaucoup pour votre remarque. Okay, Stephen, you said to give the folks just a little bit of time to switch back the audio feeds for the closed captioners. So when you think it's ready, Stephen, and the time is right, let me invite Dr. Marie Wilson to fill our screens and share your insights as well.
Thank you, Peter. I suspect that's enough time, and Dr. Marie, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to begin and thank you, Stephen, for acknowledgement of territory. Thank you, Peter, for pulling us all together with this good idea. I, too, normally would be acknowledging territory on Treaty 8 area where I live in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and Treaty 11 where we also share ancestral community. But in fact, today I am on the traditional lands of the Algonquin, and so I want to acknowledge that as well. I I have to admit, been struggling a little bit with what to offer here today. But I do want you to know, as a starting point, where I come to this conversation, and that is, and I don't know if you can see me fully, maybe I'll stand a bit, so according to my own screen, but I was raised in southwestern Ontario in a Protestant Christian tradition, and this is one of the earliest poems that I remember. Here is the church, here is the steeple, open the door and see all the people. And it's something that my father taught me when I was a very little girl. And the reason I'm sharing it with you is because it speaks to what, for me, and I think for many people in our country, probably even today, what our growing up notion of church has been, which has been a place, a gathering place, a regularized gathering place for prayer and contemplation, for spiritual guidance, for affirmation of community, for a sense of moral compass and inspiration. And I was well into adulthood before I even had any kind of an understanding or awareness of church as also being about church as property owner, church as institution, church as corporation, church as entity with enormous public influence. And those are the parts of church that became so pivotal in many ways in the unfolding of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the circumstances that led up to it. So I want to, while saying happy anniversary to the Canadian Council of Churches, I want to recall, because it speaks to the concentrated timeline of so many things that have happened, that in 1944, my parents were 17 years old. Neither I nor my three siblings existed yet in this realm, and residential schools were still alive and well, in fact, at their peak, really, across Canada and throughout, and in some parts of the Canadian North had not yet opened up and had not yet begun. So while we were, as Canadian Council of Churches, coming together with bold and moral purpose, we were, in a way, failing at that thing that Bishop has just spoke to so importantly about practicing what we preach. We were still, in many ways, doing things behind closed doors, out of sight, out of mind, and for reasons in part of expansion, of mission that had to do also with compensation and solidification of the church enterprise in the still emerging Dominion of Canada. And that is part of our story as well. It's part of the anniversary storyline that we need to be conscious of. What has happened in these past couple of decades, as with so many other things, is the fast forwarding of things, the fast forwarding of our awareness, the fast forwarding of our understanding of things. And I would like to think a fast forwarding of our efforts to do so much better in so many ways, and to continue the goodness that has also always been part of that ribbon of the church history as I have experienced it, growing up as I did with very good people with very consistent and persistent values and teachings. And yes, indeed, love was at the heart of that. But I also know then, as a young woman, when I moved to the Northwest Territories to marry my husband, who was of a different culture, who had been a residential school survivor, though I did not know it at the time of marrying him, who had been raised in an imposed system of religion, which was the Catholic Church tradition, the Roman Catholic Church tradition, I mean. One of the very first experiences I had as a young bride was not being allowed to reaffirm our marriage vows in the church that was the only church at that time in his home community, because I was Protestant and he was Catholic. And so even though we had at that point 30 years of experience almost of the Canadian Council of Churches, we still had great divides and a kind of perceived hierarchy of spirituality in our midst. And I think that is a a reality that expresses itself still today in parts of our country and perhaps beyond the Council of Churches to other faith traditions that are not yet part of the Canadian Council of Churches, or that are still not at the table, or that are still not in the rooms. And I think that that is part of our journey that we've been on through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is to see that there is no homogeneous view of all of this. We heard many people say to us things like, I love my church, the church has been so key to my healing. But we also heard people say, I hate the church, I have never set foot in the church since I left residential school, and I never will. We heard people say, the people who have surrounded me in church have helped me find myself. And we have heard other people say, all I can remember is being punished and hit with a Bible. We heard people say, of course, physical abuse and sexual abuse, and reference has been made to that today. But what we also heard, and this is the part I think that is the hardest for us to hear, we also heard enormous detail about spiritual abuse, and that is the phrase that was used. Because I think that we somehow think that if we had just been kinder, and if we had just been more attentive, and perhaps if we had been more vigilant, we would have not allowed those individuals who did great harm to have done great harm. So I think the institutional challenges before us, whether as congregations or as a council across the country, is to say how many of those lessons from that very recent past are still tripping us up today. And I think of things like, for example, this past week, many of us will have seen in the news, if we're to talk about a living faith, stories of rampant bullying and abuse in our school systems, and yet that not being recorded and that not being documented. And so we don't have proper statistics on how many children are being harmed. Well, are we able then to stand back from that as a Christian community and say, we actually have some expertise in this area. We know what the dire consequences can be when something wrong is happening and we don't record it, we don't report it, we don't tell about it, and we don't admit to it. So can we offer the hard-earned expertise of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the learnings that we have had to face up to as various church traditions and communities? Can we be honest with ourselves in knowing that even though we had a Council of Canadian Churches, we still had in this country, in the very same time frame, children who were being supervised while Anglican children and Catholic children spent their recesses throwing rocks at each other? Can we be bold enough to not just know that, but to stand back from ourselves and say, where were we not watching? Are we looking in the right places? Are we holding to proper account? And are we acting, and this I would say is the thing that I wonder about the most, is are we acting with sufficient humility? We have at the center of our tradition, and I share that, I was raised in this tradition, Jesus Christ at the center of all of our teachings and all of our longings, and all of our best examples of how we are meant to be on this earth. And yet we know, and can we easily say, that on this very continent, there are spiritual traditions that are 10 and 15,000 years older than the teachings that we've all learned from Jesus Christ. And not to say any one is better than the other, but how then do we make a council and a circle of spiritual tradition and belief wide enough that there is place for all of us in that? I think about the conclusions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think about the extremely important and powerful statements that were made by individual church leaders on behalf of specific denominations, and also the powerful statement that was made by the head of the Canadian Council of Churches at that time. And the sentence that always rings in my ears is but apology and regret is not enough. So how do we not just move on to the next thing as if there's a new thing? How do we hold on to that broad, ongoing work of reconciliation in ways that continue to challenge us and continue to nourish us, continue to enrich us, just as the healing journey of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all those who walked with us throughout that, just as we experienced together, knowing that it's really hard and that it will be for the long term. The last thing that I want to say is, you know, one of the things that has been a struggle for me, frankly, throughout in testing my own spirituality and my own Christianity has been, you know, it's been a double-edged thing, because I've always been surrounded by loving and caring people, and some I know are on this very phone call. And it has carried me through some very tough times in my personal life and some very challenging times in the work of the TRC and in the, frankly, aftermath years since, which have not been easy for me in a lot of regards. But I have also been rattled by some of the things that I've learned about my own church and our own church history that were not taught to me, and that were not who I thought I was in that context. And so we can't just sort of say that was that and now we're now. We have to think hard about those lessons that have been offered to us. What does spiritual abuse mean? And what does it mean going forward? Is mission a synonym for expansion? Must it be seen that way? Or do we have a shared understanding of what mission means? I know the question of land is pivotal to the issue of healing for Indigenous people who have said, my identity is attached to the land. And I think of the elders, many of them who have said, the Bible is written on the land, and that is where they go for their deepest healing. But what when you don't have access to those lands? And what if those lands are owned by the various many churches across the country? How do we consider the rebalance of things in that regard? And I know there have been some beautiful, bold examples, but I also know that it's not a singular story. It's inconsistent across the country. I know that there's extraordinary work being done by the churches in the area of healing, in the area of ongoing education, and in the area of engagement, widening the circle. But I also know that there are other areas where the basics of the most basic information is still not yet known. So it is ongoing work. It is uplifting work, and it is devastating work, and it is courageous work. And I know that my own commitment, both as a Christian, as a former TRC commissioner, as a mother, and as a grandmother, is that the work that I try to do is with love at the heart of it. And the last thing I would say in these opening remarks is what I carry with me very often is something that I learned and was given not in a biblical teaching, though it is the same teaching, but from an elder in our very last gathering at our very last national event, in which this elder said, lucky for us, Creator speaks many languages, and lucky for us, there is no wrong way to pray. So how do we engage in that inclusive circle and to ensure that we, in return, are as inclusive and loving and supportive? I think that is the ongoing work. I don't have any kind of a prescription. I know we did our best to provide guidance in the calls to action of the TRC that are specifically targeted to the churches who were part of the settlement agreement and to the wider faith community, many of whom have done really, really important work over the course of the commission and since. And that is the continuing journey that I think we're all on.
Fantastic, Dr. Marie. Thank you so much. calling churches to account in the commission and today. Thank you for your direct and challenging insights and remarks. Good. Pastor JoAnne, Bishop Simard, and Dr. Marie, thank you so much for those contributions and perspectives. Our program suggests that we take a few minutes to let this sink in and again, to reflect a bit, share a word or two with the folks who you are with if you're in a group in other parts of the country, here in Montreal or elsewhere. And I see that it's 2:11 on my screen. So again, just with an eye on the time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, around 2:14, I will flip us over to add another layer and invite Pastor Ken and Pastor Mary to share their perspectives. So at this stage, having heard those three, what resonates with you? Qu'est-ce qui touche votre cœur? Bring the chat box again to life and connect with one another around 2:14. I will invite Pastor Ken and Mary to begin. 2:14 Eastern Time. Okay, thank you again for the connection and for bringing the chat box and the conversation to life a bit that way. I'd like to invite Pastor Ken and Pastor Mary to add another layer to the reflection. And just a note that the next one after this is to invite Pastor Ken and Pastor Mary and Marie Wilson and Pastor JoAnne and Bishop Simard to be in conversation with one another just a little bit. Let the presenters share a bit of what strikes them about one another's contributions. So, Stephen, may I invite you to bring up Ken full screen?
Great. Thank you so much, Peter and Stephen. It's been a real gift to participate in this conversation, to be listening to the others. I've been moved and taking notes, and so I feel blessed and inspired already. So I serve here in Vancouver. It's a clear and crisp fall morning still here on Pacific Standard Time, and we here live, work, and worship on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish Coast Salish peoples. Some of you may know or may not know, some years ago, the Vancouver Foundation, a secular organization, conducted a study to try to determine what was the greatest social problem in our city, our region. And what came up as the number one answer wasn't drug abuse, though that's a serious issue here, or housing, or the prices of houses in general, but social isolation and loneliness. And so when we think about the place of Christianity in Canada, I think that one of the things that we can provide, as Dr. Marie mentioned, is a place of welcome and inclusion. Some years back, a couple of authors from the United States came to visit our church here in Vancouver to us in a book called Transforming Churches. And after one of the worship services, the authors and I sat down and they said to me, you know, we've never seen this kind of diversity in any church in the United States. How did you become this way? I understand that you used to be a monocultural church, but now it's very diverse. And I said, well, actually, we didn't have a particular strategy. And one of the authors looked at me and said, well, tell me about your life. And like JoAnne, I was born in a foreign place to Canada. I was born in Tokyo, Japan. And I said, when I was 2, our family moved briefly to New York City, and then to London, England for 5 years, and then to Vancouver when I was about 8. When I graduated from high school, I moved to Chicago and then headed back to Japan for a couple of years to work in the corporate world, moved to Boston to go to grad school, and then headed on to Southern California to start a new church with a friend, and then moved back to Vancouver. And one of the authors looked at me and said, well, Ken, where do you feel at home? And I said, you know, honestly, I don't feel especially at home anywhere. I'm a minority here in Vancouver. When I'm back in Japan, people know that I'm not really from there. I was raised in a loving family, but I don't feel completely at home anywhere. And the author looked at me and said, here's what I think you're doing. Because you've never felt at home anywhere, you're trying to set a table here at 10th where everyone is welcome, especially those who have felt homeless or an outsider in some way. And I said, you're right. That's what we're trying to do here at 10th. We're trying to set a table where everyone, no matter what their background, no matter what their lifestyle, no matter what their gender or orientation, are welcome, loved, and served. And so I think that one of the things that Christianity can do here in Canada is to set a bigger table where everyone truly is welcomed, loved, and served. Just to shift the theme for a moment, in the spring, I did a 14-city speaking tour of Canada. World Vision had asked me to travel from Victoria to St. John's, Newfoundland, and to speak to groups of pastors and Christian leaders about the survival habits of the soul, spiritual practices that I had written on. And I was recently, in fact, it was last weekend, I was up in Hay River, so I was being hosted by the Arctic Diocese of the Anglican Church of Canada. So Marie, some folks from Yellowknife were also at that gathering of pastors and Christian leaders. And among the things I learned as I traveled across the country is that no matter whether you're from a place like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal or a smaller community in Saskatchewan or Hay River, Northwest Territories or Yellowknife or the maritime provinces, people are really busy and they feel like they don't have enough time, they feel harried. And so I think that one of the things that the Christian community can bring to our cities, our towns, is spiritual practice that includes Sabbath keeping, that includes prayer and meditation, and help people experience a deeper sense of being centered, the capacity to know, perhaps even in a mystical way in some cases, that they are loved and cherished by their Creator. When I became a new pastor here in Vancouver, I met with the then mayor, a guy named Philip Owen, an Anglican Christian, and I asked Mayor Owen in his office, what is the most important thing that we could do as a church for the city of Vancouver? And I was expecting Mayor Owen to say, can you serve the homeless? Or can you help us with walking alongside people who are drug addicted and seeking some kind of freedom? But Mayor Owen surprised me by saying, Ken, the greatest thing that your church could do for the city of Vancouver is to point people to Jesus Christ, to share the gospel. I was surprised, but I feel that's the greatest gift that we can offer, to point people to Christ through loving community, through prayer, through spiritual practice, through mission that is not domineering or seeking to expand our empire for the sake of expansion, but a mission that seeks to reflect the loving and reconciling love of Jesus.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you for sharing, Pastor Ken. That's beautiful. Awesome. Pastor Mary with Hummingbird Ministries.
Yes.
Tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you, friends and relatives, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm acknowledging the people of this land where I live on the west coast of British Columbia, the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Tsawwassen, and all those who shared the lands and who kept it for us that we may live here, as one of my elders has said. I am Cree Nahiel from Saskatchewan. Just a second, got it. Okay. I am the founding director of Hummingbird Ministries, a healing and reconciliation ministry working with children, Indigenous children, to raise the profile of our people and for future generations. I'm from the Presbyterian Church, and I have called the Presbyterian Church on their confession of 1994. And I'm honored and I'm happy that they have complied with that request. It has done much good here with the children and the people that we work with on reconciliation. I want to also say that I graduated from the Vancouver School of Theology, where we were encouraged to embrace both our culture and our faith. And that was a very good journey for me. It actually fit very well with my own family background, with my mother teaching me that we had to, that she acknowledged and lived as a Cree woman. She had great respect. Well, actually, she embraced both her faith and her culture. But I want to mention that there was a group you might have heard about. It was an ecumenical and interfaith gathering in Morley, Alberta, back in the early 70s. And they called the churches to encourage Indigenous Christians to embrace their culture. And this whole movement started and ended up at VST in their Indigenous Ministries program, which is a very good idea that was actually initiated by the Treaty Chiefs in the prairies, and continues on in BC. It reached across Canada. Actually, that message went far and wide. And I say this because it's very, very important that the church learn from Indigenous spirituality and cultures. And this is what we teach the children at Hummingbird. to embrace the beautiful things. There are many beautiful things, as Chief Dan George has said in his little book as well, that there are many beautiful things about our cultures that should never have been tossed away. In fact, these things can enhance Christianity, as some of my Christian friends on the West Coast have said. There are many things, many similarities, and things that actually go beyond what the church teaches, such as, I've learned from the West Coast Longhouse people something about how to view evil. And that's something that, evil can be quite a scary thing in the Christian church, but I've learned some things from the West Coast people, many things. Another thing that I think the church can learn from is our view of humility. The prairie teachings about how the circle teachings and what some people call the medicine wheel teachings. One of the prime teachings is humility. And from my musho, my grandpa, I learned that the greatest teaching in the world, the main purpose we are sent to earth is to learn how to love, and to learn how to love beyond ourselves, beyond our cultures, beyond our race, beyond our class. It's all about God is love. What does it mean to be a Christian? It's all about love. That's the main thing. It's what I've learned. And also the embracing of all people, all my relations. It's not just all the Cree people because I'm Cree. It's all the people, all the races, and even those that have done us harm. It's a very important thing, and I think Jesus would agree with that. It's not a matter of just loving Christians. And it's not a matter of missions as in terms of making everybody like us, but making everybody like who we perceive Jesus to be and how we understand him. Stephen Kendall mentioned that, yes, this is one perspective of one Indigenous person, but we do share a terrible history in Canada. And we could all learn from this experience. And we have a long way to go in terms of healing, but I am encouraged that I'm beginning to see where there's light in the church, where there's genuine love, there's genuine witness of who I understand Jesus Christ to be. And I'm trying to also, with our children, teaching them our culture is part of the healing process. It's a very important healing part of who we are as Indigenous people. The children are from many different Indigenous cultures. They're not just prairie, they're not just West Coast, they're some from Eastern Canada. We've worked with children who are from Quebec. And one of the things I think that we have done to help them, and that the church has helped, is we teach them our dances, our powwow dances, our Métis dances, and inviting West Coast dances if they're willing to teach the children. So what the children have learned is that, or what has happened in their school, is that they now have a culture. On Culture Day, the children are able to be part of their Culture Day. And before that, they didn't have a culture. In fact, they were being told by some of the newer Canadians that they should go home to their own country, to their own land. So this country has a long way to go, not only with the European Canadians, but with the new Canadians that come to this land and don't know anything about us and have the nerve to say, go home to our children. So the similarities, I go back to the similarities and the purpose of life, and also the fact that the census, I've read some things about how many Indigenous people are Christian. And according to this report, the majority were Christian from all denominations, but some of them, like there was only 2% Indigenous who follow Indigenous ways. I don't think that's accurate. In fact, they mentioned that they didn't go to reserves to interview people. I think to hold on to our Indigenous views is very, very important. And I don't mean just Canadian Indigenous, but people from all over the world who know the land. And Marie Wilson, you mentioned the land and how important that is to Indigenous people, but also to all people. I think you mentioned that it's necessary for healing, and that the Bible was written on this land, and so true. But I also think that it's not a matter of the laws. You know, our people looked at the earth, looked at creation, and saw the Creator reflected in them, in the way the earth is created. That's our Bible, our people's Bible in the traditional times, to look at creation and to understand what the laws mean, to understand God through His creation, but not only in the earth, not only in the waters and the trees and the sun and the skies, but also in each other. And I think that's what we need to do, is look at each other, not as whether we're Christian or not as whether you're going to follow Christ the way I do, but to follow love, to follow your heart, the heart that God gave us, the heart that we could all claim, and we could make this world a beautiful place. We can shed light on the darkness of racism, shed light on so many things that are wrong in this world. Anyway, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to talk and share with you. Hi, thanks.
And thank you, Pastor Mary, for sharing. Wonderful and powerful. Okay, Stephen, can we bring up all 5 screens? And might it be possible for Pastor JoAnne and Bishop Simard and Dr. Marie and Pastor Ken and Pastor Mary? I wonder, as you listen to one another, how those questions strike you. What resonated with what you heard from others? And what does it mean for Christians and for the Church in Canada? What comes to mind from what you heard from others?
Okay, I should mention that while our guests turn their cameras on, we're going to take about 30 seconds. The person who is doing the French closed captioning is having trouble with her telephone line. So she's going to hang up and dial back in again, and hope that she gets a clearer sound from the French simultaneous translator. So we're just going to give her about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to make sure that she can reconnect, so that those who are watching the French captions can get as clear a signal as possible. And thanks for your patience.
Great, thank you. And while that happens, I'll just maybe mention too, just programmatically, program and time-wise, that we are committed to ending at the committed time. So we have got about 25 minutes with us together. And so that will be a few minutes for interaction among the presenters. And we'll give a few minutes to let that chat box come to life, and for a couple of questions to one another in the spaces. And then a thanks and a closing prayer will end out our time together.
Dr. Marie Wilson coming on video.
Stephen? I think he's just establishing that technical connection in the background yet for a moment.
So Dr. Wilson, your mic is on.
Yes.
Here, I'll give you a prompt to start your camera. And it looks to me like
There
Looks
I
to
am.
me like our closed captioner has reestablished a phone connection. I hope it's more clear for her. Peter, over to you.
Great. Who would like to jump in from among our presenters?
Yeah, I can lead off if that's okay. I think I'm
Please.
yeah, I'm glad to see that you came up again, Dr. Marie Wilson. I really appreciated your insight and had not thought about this before, that some of the lessons learned from the abuses in the residential schools, the bullying, the worst in bullying, can actually be applied in the current context where many students, probably countless students here in Canada, are experiencing that kind of bullying and abuse. So thank you for sharing that. I think that was very helpful and a way that demonstrates how the Christian church can speak into the current context, and perhaps God can redeem some of the sin and suffering of the past in that way.
Well, if I may just say a word of response, and thank you for that comment. You know, as we move into life beyond residential schools as the focal point of the story, I think the challenge for us to say is how much of that was actually about the schools, and how much of it was about our attitudes about racial and cultural and spiritual superiority, and how much of that is still in play today. How much of it is about our use of words and what we mean by them from a particular perspective. I think about, for instance, I'm sure you've all heard, the number of Indigenous children that are in the child welfare system today having surpassed significantly the number of children who were in the residential schools at their peak. And so that notion of removing children from culture, whether or not from direct family, because no one is saying we should leave children in harm's way, but from culture and sense of belonging and sense of relationship and sense of connection and sense of knowing who they are and where they are from, we're still doing that. And we're still doing it, and we're opposing the challenge not to do it anymore in courts. And so was the lesson about don't have residential schools anymore? Or was the lesson about reconsider with great humility your notions of cultural and spiritual and emotional superiority? When we, for example, use as a reason for removing children poverty, is poverty a synonym of neglect, or is poverty just our failure to figure out how to equitably distribute resources in our country? And then we blame the poor for being poor by removing their children. Are addictions about addictions, or are they about the self-medicating that goes on when people are living in such despair because of the inequities and the lack of opportunities and the lower levels of education that happen when children are raised in contexts of trauma and fear and shame? So I think the bigger lessons, I think we're still just really beginning to even consider them, much less learn them. And I really challenge all of us, I'm not separating myself from any of this, that I challenge all of us to keep looking and to if we have not somehow changed our lenses about how we go through life as a result of what the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has taught us, then we've failed the golden opportunity that was given to us by the survivors, who are the heroes of that story, who drew us all to attention and had to whack us over the head before we could even begin to see ourselves in a different light. And that is, we have barely begun that work. So thank you for your comment, and I just think further about that, because we're inching forward. As people say to me, are we making progress? And I say, I feel we're inching forward, because I do know that there's some magnificent work going on in various parts of the country. And I do know that the rest of the world is looking closely at us, hoping for inspiration.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for elaborating further.
I think that in addition to the story and experiences of the First Nations people, what I've learned as a Canadian, as I grow to know the story, that there are my people's story in this land. And I didn't learn that until I had to study history in a different way, that the railroads were built by the Chinese people, the Chinese migrant workers, that really out of desperation, they needed to move. And it was through a seminary course that finally my professor told me that stop writing about the Chinese people from another person's lens. Where are the Chinese people in your paper? So he made me to write the paper all over again. And so in that, especially the study tour that I have, Canadian Japanese pastor who brought us to the different internment camps, where several of the sites have no marking, have no sense of repentance. I think some of the people that have typed in the chat, where are we as a people if we can't acknowledge that we have strayed, we have done wrong, because then we don't know where to move from. So, for example, I'm still learning and reminding myself every time I speak, I need to acknowledge that the land that I'm on in Ottawa is belonging to the unceded and surrendered land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. It teaches me what does it mean to be Chinese and to embrace that I don't have to choose between the two. And I think, how do we teach that in schools where we come in and people still comment, to me, wow, your English is really good. And I often try to be funny and go, well, your English is really good too, because I learned just like you. What is it when we talk to each other that we can't see beyond what society has constructed as limitations? I appreciate what Ken was saying about home, because I moved around a lot too, and I think partly it was because I didn't feel at home. And it's not something that somebody else can make me feel at home. I think that in church, in Christ, I have found that I'm received as I am, however that I am. And so what a great message that the mayor said to you, that you need to lead people to Jesus. And sometimes we think that we need to do something else. We need to fill up the box for food bank and everything else. And we miss the job and the task of bearing the gospel and living that out. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
Je crois que.
Allez-y, Bishop Simard.
Yeah. Do you want me to speak in French?
Let me ask Stephen what works best.
If you're going to speak in French, Bishop, then please give our captioners 20 seconds to shift the audio signal they're listening to. If you prefer to speak in English, they won't have to switch.
Okay, so I will speak in English,
That's very gracious of you. Thank you.
You're welcome. First of all, I think that what I heard, it's that we live on earth. It is our common house, and we need to work together. The Pope Francis, in his encyclical, has spoken Laudato Si about, the necessity to work together and to work very hard to preserve our environment. And I've spoken about the ecology, where everybody has a place to live in. And as you mentioned, I think it's not I don't know if it's Mary Wilson or Mary, but it is not only about, the trees, the sun, it's about the human beings. We need to speak of an integral ecology where we're part of the creation, and we need to work together and to respect each other. And I think what I heard also, we need to have a vision where people are included. We cannot, think of proclaiming the faith in excluding. We need to include. We need a very inclusive way of working and preaching and reaching out. I think that's a word also that I retain, to reaching out to those who are rejected sometimes by the economy, by the, no place on the land. So we need, to truly put into action what the gospel is telling us. And so it is a common home and an integral ecology, and also to reach out. For me, it is necessary. Otherwise, we will be not listened to. In order to have a word in the world today, we have to proclaim the gospel into action and in concrete actions, and especially to take care. And it's for that reason that the church must be like a field hospital, which is not worry about, structures and to stay where it is, but to be able to move. So we need, a moving church in order to be relevant, as you mentioned, JoAnne, to be relevant in the world today.
Thank you so much. And Mary Fontaine, what resonated with you? What does this mean to you?
Well, I'm grateful for all the comments that are made. I like the reference, Bishop, to the environment and how important that is, how important it is to keep the, to be good stewards of the land, of this earth for future generations, a very important responsibility for us as Christians and for Indigenous people, for sure. The idea of home, Ken and JoAnne, I love that that idea, and it made me think of some friends of mine who are homeless, and actually I went through that experience myself a little bit in seeking a place to live in this area. It is so expensive to live here. I really think that life shouldn't be all about money. I don't know when we're going to learn that as humanity, that the economy is not the most important thing in life. Life is not about money. It's about love. It's about relationships with each other, with the land, and keeping it all intact. Working together, as you say, to make those things happen. To be of one heart as we sit around the circle trying to come to terms with the problems that we encounter in this world as Christians, from our perspective, to bring healing to the poor, but also to ourselves, never excluding ourselves from that equation, because we're not perfect, as we all know. We all need to work on our own problems, our own issues. I think and Dr. Marie Wilson, I appreciate all your comments and the wisdom that you bring with you from the TRC and your knowledge of the Indigenous people that you've worked with and been part of. I've always appreciated your perspectives in the different places that I've heard you speak, especially when you were in Vancouver. It's a good idea to do this, Peter. I appreciate what you're doing and your organization and all such organizations such as the World Community Reformed Churches and the the WCC. I appreciate what all the churches are doing through justice works like this, but also at the grassroots level. This is where you feel the crunch and the pinch, because it's often not there. People in the pews are still really lost as far as this goes. They're just learning. The good news is they're starting to learn and acknowledge Indigenous people, but sometimes it's quite discouraging because you've been working for so many years, and then all of a sudden, someone asks you a question that you realize, okay, they either just didn't listen, or you're out of their radar. But yeah, it's a huge problem, and I know that the migrants also have a huge problem in this country. Women are continuing to struggle. The gay community struggles, and there's so many places where the light can shine through the darkness. But the Christianity today, for me, brings when I see the light, the genuine light, it's hopeful, it's encouraging, and it's uplifting to know when you see someone walking the talk of their faith. And I say that about us Christians, but also I've seen that among Muslims. I've seen that among people. I was a member of the WCRC for a while, and I've listened to lots of stories, and there is hope. So I see glimmers of hope here and there everywhere, and I'm grateful for that.
Wow, and thank you so much, everyone, for the light and life and hope that you've all spoke about and that you all live. It's 2:51, and we'll move to the sort of a few words of thanks and an appeal and closing in 4 minutes at 2:55. So Stephen Kendall, please be ready in about 3 or 4 minutes for that. So in the meantime, in the few minutes that we have there, again, please share what's on your mind. What's the synthesis? Is there a synthesis comment that you'd like to make? Is there a conclusion? Is there a question? Is there a challenge? Is there something that was especially meaningful for you? Please take a moment to share that with each other in person or in the Zoom chat box. And at 2:55, I'll invite Stephen Kendall to step right into the closing section. So there are some important questions filling the Zoom group chat box, more reflections to think about, certainly lots of challenging comments, but also hopeful ones. And I'm very blessed and thankful for all of your participation and for joining this conversation today. And for the Canadian Council of Churches for helping to make this possible. So I'd like to pass Stephen, if you could bring up Stephen Kendall, that would be great. There are one or two slides yet still that that we might use. Some closing comments and thanks from Stephen, and then there's a brief slide with a donate button on it to have a look at, and a closing prayer from the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity 2020. Okay. They showed us unusual kindness is the theme this year.
Stephen,
Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, Stephen, I don't see you on the participant list. I wonder if you've signed in as under a different name, but if you could enable your camera and your mic, now is the time.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Can you turn your camera on too?
Okay, yeah, I'm trying to. It says you cannot start your video because the host has disabled it.
Oh,
and
there we go. I have the
I've just
power.
been
How
online
about
the whole
that?
time.
Let me see if I can ask you to start your video. Does that work?
Bingo.
Wonderful.
There we go. I'm here. Well, I know we're very quickly reaching the end. I'm sad about that. I want to just say a few words of thanks. Thank you so much to our presenters. JoAnne, you spoke of the need to be in mission for others, and that would be the way that we can stick out, perhaps the way God would have us to do. Bishop Simard, you challenged us to practice what we preach, reminded us the Christian faith cannot be a private matter, and that our source in Jesus Christ is the way we must go. Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for being with us. You spoke of this work being uplifting, devastating, and courageous, and as always, you have been uplifting and in the best way for us, devastating, and as always, courageous. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Ken, wonderful to have you with us as well. The concept of social isolation and loneliness being something that we must respond to, and providing a place of welcome and inclusion that includes healthy spiritual practices is a learning for us. And Mary, I was really struck when you said that in truth, all Indigenous people do share something, and that is all Indigenous people share a terrible history. I was struck by that, and I'll be thinking about that for a long time. But thank you also for your teachings and your learnings that you've shared with us from other cultures on evil and on humility and on love, and the things that are so beautiful that we can learn from other cultures. Just a word also of thanks to Stephen Fetter for your wonderful work in the technology. It seems like this is just run like clockwork, and I know behind the scenes that doesn't automatically happen. Thank you very much for holding our hands where necessary and making all the things work. Thank you to the interpreters, those doing the closed captioning. Also, it was very good experience on the screen, certainly from my perspective. Thank you to Peter for pulling this together, and all the staff in the Canadian Council of Churches that have worked on this. We're very grateful for that. I do need to say thank you to Ecclesiastical Insurance as well, who has provided some funding to make this possible. And I perhaps most of all to all the participants who've taken time in a Saturday afternoon to join in what I hope for you has been a very stimulating and helpful, and perhaps even hopeful afternoon. And Peter, I guess I can turn it over to you now for a reminder about the button on Canada Helps that we can all click to donate to the Canadian Council of Churches, and the closing prayer. Bless you all.
Right, Stephen, there's just a couple of slides there. So it's, of course, the Canada Helps button. Of course, there were no fees for this event, and we don't even really want to tie this appeal to this event. But on the 75th anniversary, if you could see your way clear to include the Canadian Council of Churches on your charitable giving, we would, of course, greatly appreciate that. So there's a button on the council's website. Click away, and that would be that. So here's a closing prayer for us. It's taken from the 2020 Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. Let me lead you in this brief responsive reading. The Week of Prayer for Christian Unity is celebrated every year in January with a special event, but can be celebrated at any time throughout the year. Every year the theme is a little bit different, and the country doing the work is different. In 2020, the country is Malta, and the theme is that they showed us unusual kindness. Malta is, of course, an island in the Mediterranean, and the Apostle Paul, when he was shipwrecked, mentioned that they showed unusual kindness. And indeed, that is repeated in the refugees arriving in the islands in the Mediterranean on a regular basis. So that's the theme and the connection. I invite you to click to the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity or weekofprayer.ca, where you'll find all the resources you need to mark that as a community. So let me read. I'll read this again, a responsive reading in English and French. We are sent out together to proclaim the good news. We've come together as Christians and therefore as fellow disciples. As we yearn for Christian unity, let us commit ourselves anew to work for this common goal. May God the Father, who called us from darkness into light, make us true bearers of God's light. Que Dieu le Fils, qui nous a rachetés par son précieux sang, nous donne la force de suivre son exemple en servant les autres. And may God, the Holy Spirit, who is Lord and giver of life, strengthen us to endure the shipwrecks of life and to reach the shores of salvation. Que Dieu Tout-Puissant et miséricordieux, Père, Fils et Saint-Esprit, nous bénisse et nous protège, maintenant et toujours. Amen. We will set out together to proclaim the wonders of God's love. Amen. Hallelujah. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for your participation and joining in with us today. We really appreciate it. Wish you a fine Saturday, a good weekend, a Sabbath day of rest, and a beautiful Sunday service. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Peter. I'm going to put Peter and our translators into a small breakout room so that they can debrief briefly with each other, and we'll wish the rest of you well, and thank you for joining us.